Well, thanks everybody. Nice to see a good crowd here. And Happy New Year, of course, as we've discussed. Well, let's get straight on with the show. We have some other meetings again on the second Monday of the month lined up. They're on the our website. About them. But without further ado, I will introduce Scott Xavier Goodrich, who is a man of many talents, it seems, from classics to marine biology and a musician to boot. So
yeah,
so it's good that you've given up some time to speak with us about something I'm know very little about and going to be all ears. So I think over to you, Scott, if that's all right.
thank you very much, Paul. Thanks for inviting me, and Happy New Year, everyone. So I'm going to be talking today about the wonderful world of salt marshes and what they can do for us and why they are so wonderful. And I've really fallen in love with them during my research I did on them. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I was saying I could waffle on about this topic forever because it's just one of my favorite topics. I do have an eye on the time because I do want there to be time afterwards for you to ask me any questions, should you have any. So yes, welcome to the wonderful world of salt marshes and why we should protect them. First, a couple of words about myself. So I'm an environmental scientist. I studied environmental and sustainability studies and marine environmental protection. And after working as a marine biologist in a lab for a while, I founded the charity Plover Rovers, which is a marine communication charity, science communication charity. And one of our main, our two main goals really are to bring the marine community together with the coastal communities, or generally with the general public really in Britain, because we think that a lot of the time the scientists are still sort of working away too much on their own and not actually getting out there talking to people. So we had a project called Talking the Coast, where we got the scientists out of the universities and put them into coastal towns and got them talking to people, which was really great. And also we're doing a lot of science communication and arts stuff, which fits in with my second my second job, basically, which is I am an artist myself. I'm the guitarist and vocalist of a hard rock band. I've been doing that ever since I'm 16 years old. There used to be times in my life when I was a professional musician. At the moment, I'm not doing that to earn my money, luckily, because I probably wouldn't be earning any, especially not with COVID now. But that's my other passion. And then I'm also a Latin language teacher because my first degree was a master's in classics. So I'm also a big fan of ancient history and the Latin language. So that's the three things I do. And what I'm always passionate about is really communicating the things that I think are important, that I'm passionate about. And salt marshes are just one of these wonderful things that I'm really passionate about. So that's the salt marsh. I always think it's when I started talking about salt marshes to my friends and family after I started studying marine biology or marine environmental sciences, really, not so much marine biology, everyone was always really confused that I was talking to them about meadows rather than about dolphins, diving with sharks, coral reefs, the sort of thing that you expect from a marine scientist. And I myself didn't know anything about salt marshes before I didn't start doing my research on them, really. And I've grown to absolutely love these muddy meadows that where you have to keep an eye out on the tide at all times, because otherwise it's going to trap you somewhere and you're going to have to be wading through channels this high up in water, which happened during our field work, because once we forgot to check the tide times, and of course we got cut off and had to carry all our expensive gear through the flooding creeks. But yeah, so they're a wonderful habitat. They look kind of drab sometimes and not very exciting, but they're actually really exciting for a number of reasons, which I shall talk about. So first of all, what is a salt marsh? You're probably all more or less familiar with them. They're very common all around the coast of the UK. So they're basically a mud flat where plants manage to gain a little foothold and then manage to build up a plant covering. So we've got the mud flat, we've got these typical green algae here up front that are covering the mud, and then we've got a couple of pioneer plants. It's mostly samphire, which is also something that tastes really good. Sometimes they have it at Waitrose, and it's ridiculous how much it costs. If you're working on the marshes, you can always like take a bit home and have it for dinner. Not too much, of course, and not if it's protected area. And Spartina, so cord grasses. These are the two pioneer plants that kind of manage to settle out on the mud, and then because they fix the mud, they give it a bit of stability, then other plants can come and settle around them, and you get these little mounds of plant matter that start building up, and then bit by bit a marsh is built up around these little islands of plants. And then you've got a very dynamic environment with creeks. The creeks I was mentioning that you have to wade through if you're not keeping an eye on the tide times, where the tide comes in and out of the marsh. It's the whole environment is incredibly dynamic, which makes it at once kind of resilient and fragile, because it's resilient because it's used to a lot of change. It's used to all of the plants living on a salt marsh, and the animals living on the salt marsh are species that are able to adapt to quite extreme changes in their environment. But at the same time, it's a very delicate balance, and if this balance gets upset, it's a habitat that can degrade very, very quickly. What lives there? Lots of interesting plants that have learned to deal with regular flooding of salt water, and then a bunch of animals as well. We've got the little rodents, which come out on the marsh to search for food. And if you have zones with a big tidal range, for example, in the Severn estuary, if you have a big spring tide, there's a nature spectacle when the tide comes rushing in, and all the little rodents will run from the marsh and they will seek higher ground, and the birds of prey know this, so they will come and they'll have their buffet on the higher ground, so they come swooping down looking for the rodents. So we've got the birds of prey. We've got a marsh harrier here, which I've had the good fortune of seeing a couple of these while I was doing research out on the marsh, and then birds that feed on the mudflats and then come and roost on the salt marshes. And we've got some birds breeding there as well, like redshank or skylarks. So it's a very biodiverse area, which a lot of people don't realize when they just go and walk their dogs there, because it does look a little bit drab, and all of these animals are very good at hiding. But so in a lot of marshes, there's massive problems with dog walkers, because they think it's just a place to walk your dog. It's just a bit of a muddy meadow, really, and then they will just let their dogs run free, and the dogs flush out all the birds and really disturb them when they're nesting and roosting. So one of the main conflicts between humans and marshes centers around dog walking, actually, because they're very popular for that. Like I said, it's a very common habitat in the UK. We find it pretty much all around the coasts. That does not mean that it's not a habitat that's under threat. So all of these little black dots are salt marshes. So we have them in a lot of places, but very often the single marshes are actually in a relatively precarious position, or in danger of shrinking, or in danger of degrading. So just because it's common habitat doesn't mean it's a habitat that's not under threat, unfortunately. There are a lot of programs now to try to regain marsh area overall. Probably about 75% of marshes in the UK that used to be there have been lost over the past 120 years, more or less. So there used to be a lot more marsh area that's been lost to drainage and building and dredging and whatnot. So it is at once common and under threat. But we still have about 820 square kilometers of coastal marshes. So it's still it's an important habitat for the UK. And that's also why it's very important in the UK's of carbon budgeting, which I'm going to come to in a little bit. This is a lot of these marshes that you saw now as these black dots on the map are also quite small. So this, for example, is a salt marsh just beside Bristol Harbour. So you see the industrial area of Bristol there in the background, and then there's this meadow area where I'm on there with a little group of people that I'm taking on the marsh, and that is the marsh. So it's a very small place, but at the same time, for this area, this is one of the biodiversity hotspots of the area. So this is a good example for just how small these important areas can be. And this marsh in particular is under a lot of threat because it's very squeezed in. There's a building development, residential development right behind the seawall. There's masses of dog walkers using this marsh, and people there are trying very hard to sort of protect the biodiversity and the functionality of this marsh from people basically just trampling it to death. So that's the marshes. They all, more or less, every marsh is going to have the same zonation. This can vary a bit. It's never sort of a straight line. Marshes can go up and down, and you're all of a sudden going to have a low marsh zone somewhere in the middle because the ground is lower. But overall, you could say that there's a typical marsh zonation that starts down at the mudflat. Then you have the pioneer zone, like I said, where you've got the pioneering plants, the colonizing plants, Spartina and the samphire. Then you've got the lower marsh, which is an area that's still flooded very, very regularly, pretty much with every tide, where you've got special grasses, especially relatively low plants, which can deal with a lot of saltwater flooding. You've got the middle marsh, where you've got the juncus, which is the bulrush, these kind of a bit larger shrubs, which still gets flooded quite regularly, but not quite as often. So it's not quite as saline up there. And then you've got the upper marsh, which is basically shrubs and phragmites, reed beds, and then kind of goes into the terrestrial vegetation. So that's the basic salt marsh zonation that we can, in some way or the other, pretty much see in every marsh that we that we come to. Now, this is, like I said, very dynamic environment, and these zones are very movable, and they need to be able to move, because if you've got things like a big storm, for example, it can kind of push the whole marsh landwards, because it'll wash away a part of the lower marsh, and then sort of the marsh will reform, reshape. If you've got sea level rise and the sea level rises a couple permanently, you will have a landward migration of the marsh, where it's kind of backing away from the sea and pulling everything back a little bit. If this works, then it's a very resilient habitat. So theoretically, if there weren't any man-made structures like seawalls, for example, in places where we don't have a natural cliff face that is blocking the marsh, we would have a habitat that, for example, would be very resilient to climate change, because as the sea level rises, the marsh would be able to migrate landward. However, in most cases, especially in a country that's as built up as the UK, a lot of marshes have a seawall somewhere in the back, because the land behind the seawall has been reclaimed either for settlement or in most cases for agriculture, which means that as the sea level rises, or when there's a big storm, the sea just pushes in and squeezes the salt marsh, so that the area that is a marsh area actually becomes smaller and smaller. So like the marsh that I just showed you in Bristol, this would be a very good example of a marsh that is squeezed in. There's a seawall right behind it. So if the sea level rises only maybe 1 or 2 centimeters here, this entire marsh will go. It'll just turn into a mudflat again. So this doesn't have any possibility to migrate anywhere. So at the moment, what they're trying to do here is create marsh areas further down the Severn estuary, where you will, at least the wildlife will basically be able to leave this marsh once it gets flooded and go to another area where it can live. So we will lose a lot of these marshes where there's no possibility for them to migrate landwards as the sea levels rise. Now, why should we care about this at all? Like I said, I mean, there's a lot of biodiversity. It's an important habitat, but it's not only about the biodiversity. Salt marshes do a lot of things for us, and this is where the whole concept of ecosystem services comes in. It's a concept that is among biologists or among ecologists, it's somewhat contended, because it does very much fall in with the sort of the capitalist way of thinking, where you put a price tag on everything and then you kind of say this is worth something because this performs a service for us. So it's very anthropocentric. It's very much thinking from a human point of view, what can a habitat do for us? And how much is this service worth? But it's a very helpful tool when you're talking to policymakers and politicians, because they understand this kind of language. So if you can tell them the salt marsh is worth so and so many millions of pounds, then this is a language they understand. So the ecosystem services concept has been very popular, developed somewhere in the 90s, I think early 90s, and it's been very popular ever since, for ecologists to kind of argue around makers and politicians. But among environmentalists, it's not a very popular concept. However, it does serve to really illustrate all the things that these marshes do for us. So what do salt marshes do for us? There's a whole bunch of ecosystem services they provide. They offer flood protection because they alleviate the power of the waves. So if you have an area that the waves need to run over during a winter storm, the power of the waves that actually hits the area behind that marsh area will be much reduced. So the flooding will be much less severe. Also, salt marshes can actually absorb a lot of water as well. So they're very good flood protection. They can, for the same reason, they reduce the risk of coastal erosion. They're like a buffer zone for coastal erosion. Then they are really good at storing carbon, and that was the main topic of my research. I'll talk about that in more detail in a bit. They can purify and detoxify water. For example, if you have agricultural runoff, the marsh will almost act like a sieve, where a purification sieve, where it'll catch a lot of the toxins or the nitrogen that is put in agriculture. However, this is not a very good ecosystem service actually, because if a marsh does that, basically all its other services suffer. So it's not like you can just say, oh, let's just plop marshland there and then just put all the toxins and everything from upstream through the marsh, and then we've got wonderful water. So it does that, but it comes at a cost for the ecosystem. It's great for education because it's actually a marine habitat, somewhat marine habitat that you can take people onto. So this is a bit like the rocky shore. As marine scientists, we always struggle with that. What's actually underneath the waves, people can't really see if they're not divers. So you're kind of depending on showing it to people the second hand. They can't have that first hand experience. But on a marsh, you can take people and you can show them the wildlife there, and you can show them a lot of things related to the marine ecosystem, and they're actually there. It's easy to access. If you do watch the tide times, it's something you can do with relatively small kids. It's not as dangerous as the rocky shore where you can break your ankle or fall into a rock pool. So that's great. It's great for education. In a lot of places where there's significant marsh areas, it's very important for culture. Lots of artists are inspired by the marshes. I've met quite a lot of artists during my work with the Plover Rovers who are doing art around salt marshes. So, and it's part of the cultural makeup of an area. If you go to places like around the Wash, like Wells by the Sea and these places, there's a lot of, I think there's actually a salt marsh art gallery there. Which is was great to prove the point. So it's culturally important, of course, for recreation. You can use it, dog walking, of course, and then it's great for biodiversity. So they're often hotspots in a local area for biodiversity. So these are all these things that salt marshes do for us, and then of course they also provision food as well, if you like to eat that. Then, as I was saying, I'm going to focus on the carbon storage that they can do. So coastal wetlands in general are very, very important for storing carbon, which makes them an important ally in the fight against climate change, and especially salt marshes and seagrass meadows and mangrove woods. So these are the three the three habitats that are normally in the focus when people talk about what is called blue carbon. Blue carbon is all the carbon that is sequestered, so taken up by marine ecosystems. So this would be the ocean itself, but it would also be coastal ecosystems like mangroves or marshes. This is just a little reminder of the global monthly average carbon dioxide concentration, which has been going up, 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 up. This graph only starts in 1980. So you can see that there's a steady rise in carbon dioxide. It's not the most powerful greenhouse gas, but it's by far the most, there's the most of it. So reducing carbon dioxide is really one of the main focuses of the fight against climate change. About 84% of the increase of the heat trapping capacity on Earth are due to carbon dioxide. So plants are obviously important allies in the fight against this. And what's amazing about these blue carbon ecosystems, and which is something that I was for sure not aware of before I studied it, is that they actually take up a lot more carbon than terrestrial forests do. I for one was always thinking about the rainforest, like that's the green lung of the earth. That's you know, for sure the place that takes up the most carbon dioxide, but it actually isn't. This is the carbon burial rate in grams per square meter per year. So grams of carbon per square meter per year. And you can see that salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrass meadows are incredibly powerful in the amount of carbon that they store within that amount of earth, if you compare it to the forests. Now, why is that? Why are they so efficient at it, even though the forests have all the big trees and the big plants and all of these? I mean, mangroves have trees, but salt marshes just have grass, basically. Seagrass meadows, that's just seagrass. Why are they so powerful? One of the reasons is that what is a big difference between the forests and these marine ecosystems is that most of the carbon that they store is actually in the form, not of living biomass, but of carbon that's in the soil, so soil organic matter. In a salt marsh, because we have grasses there, there's not much carbon at all in the living biomass, so in the living plants, because the plants are tiny, if you compare them to the big forests. But it's a very fast turnover. So a marsh is basically deposits carbon very, very quickly, much quicker than a forest. And that's why a lot of carbon ends up in the soil. And that's the carbon that is especially interesting when we're looking at carbon storage, because as long as the carbon is in the living biomass, it's not fixed yet. So a lot of that carbon will actually go back into the atmosphere. Or if you have carbon in trees, if that tree is felled and burned, for example, it will just release that carbon that it captured. Why, if you have a log burner like I have, you will see that all the companies selling firewood are now making commercials with that it's carbon neutral, because you basically release exactly as much carbon back into the air as that tree once captured. So once the carbon is in the ground, it's somewhat more stable, and that's why these marine ecosystems are so important for carbon capture. Carbon in salt marshes comes basically from two angles. There's the uptake of atmospheric carbon by the plants through photosynthesis, so the breathing of the plants, where they just take up the carbon and integrate. They take out the CO2 of the atmosphere, just a short repetition on photosynthesis here. And with the energy of the light, they have this process where they produce oxygen, which we can breathe, and where they incorporate the carbon into their living plant material. Basically, I always say, especially when I'm talking to younger audiences, they just eat it. That's their food. And then it's in the plant matter, and then as the plants decay, it gets deposited in the earth. And the second source of carbon in salt marshes is actually carbon that is already dissolved in the water, in the ocean, which is there in tiny particles. And these particles get washed in with the tides and then trapped around the plants, and they also settle out. This is much the carbon coming in through the dissolved particles in the water is not as much carbon as the atmospheric carbon, but it is a measurable amount, and it does mean that it increases the efficiency of the carbon storage in the marsh, because we've got these two sources of carbon coming in. And then it gets buried through the processes of deposition, basically, on the marsh. Now, what I was looking at in my research was the idea was that we know all this. We know there's a lot of carbon in these marshes, and what we're interested in, and we were talking about models before this talk started, is to develop models which help us predict how much carbon a marsh can store in the future, and also is storing right now at the moment. Again, thinking about policies, this could be important if you want to protect a certain marsh area, and you could say, well, this marsh is worth X, tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds, because at the moment it's already storing this and that much carbon, and in the future it will store this and that much more carbon. And then talking about carbon credits and net zero and everything, we could just do a calculation how much this space is actually worth. So for this, we need robust modeling to be able to determine how powerful the carbon storage capacity of marshes is. And for that, we need to know what drives the carbon storage. What's important to look at? Do we have to look at elevation relative to tidal range? Do we have to look at the sediment properties? Do we have to look at things like grain size, porosity of the sediment? Do we have to look at the plant assemblages? Will that make a huge difference? Do we have to look at things like chemical things like pH or things like that? So my research was all around finding out which parameters are the main drivers of carbon store in salt marshes, and what can influence these drivers, and what happens if you start looking up top, but then if you really go low down and look at the carbon storage that's below 50 centimeters, for example. That's what happens there. What about that? What's that driven by? Is that the same drivers? Is that different drivers? So that was my research that I was doing. I looked at 4 marshes. It's not very many to build models on, but that was all that we had funding for. So we looked at 2 marshes up on the west coast, around Sunderland and Leeds. Looked at 1 in Wales, North Wales, and then we looked at 1 up on the east coast. And the idea was that we spread it out like that, was that we wanted to look at relatively different marshes. So we wanted to look at a different sediment structure. So the east coast is very different from the west coast. If you look at the east coast is much more like fine grain, silt, muddy. The west coast is more sandy. And we wanted to look at different plant assemblages as well, if possible. And then so these were my marshes. Also, some of these marshes were grazed by cattle. Some of these marshes were left completely alone. So that was also interesting to see if there was going to be a difference between these more heavily used marshes and the other ones. This was us doing our field work. So what we did is basically we set up a transect starting in the mudflat, and then we went all the way up to the terrestrial fringe of the marsh. So we sampled all these different marsh zones that I was talking about, mudflat, lower marsh, middle marsh, high marsh, to also see how the carbon storage develops as you go from the low marsh to the high marsh. Because again, if we're looking at sea level rise and if we're looking at coastal squeeze and the shrinking of marshes, it was interesting to see how the different zones would maybe react differently to how as to the drivers of carbon storage and how much carbon they were able to store. And the heart of this whole research was really that we didn't only look at the marsh going from the sea to the terrestrial fringe, but we also really looked into the marsh. So what was quite special was that we went down to depths of over 1 meter with our course, and most research had only looked at about the first 30 centimeters of marsh soil when assessing the carbon storage. Now that's problematic for 2 reasons, because first of all, the first kind of 10 centimeters, that's just the root area for the grasses, so that you're going to have a lot of carbon there because there's just a lot of organic matter right where the roots are, at the roots themselves. So that's anyway very high in carbon. And then as you go down, the carbon kind of breaks down, and we were interested in what does the carbon storage actually look like further down, because that's kind of where the carbon really stays, where it's not going to be broken down as much anymore by chemical processes. It doesn't have any oxygen anymore, so it's kind of like it's stored there for good. So that's why we went further down with our course than what most research had done before. These are the finished cores, so you hammer them in and you pull them out. It's all very basic, plastic tube, sledgehammer, a jack to pull them out. It's very physical labor. There was nothing fancy about it. And then you have these tubes that you saw off, and you get like these very beautiful mud cores. And you can already see how on the left there on the picture, this is the sandier sediments, and then on the right of that picture, that's more muddy, silty sediments. So all of these cores were very different depending on where in the marsh they were taken and on what location they were taken. And already there you could see that probably these marshes function quite differently depending on the sediment structure and also the depth which you're looking at. That's just what we did in the lab. Basically, I was always telling my friends and family, I'm just baking mud cakes just on the professional level now. So it's just to say that what you do when you're 5, but now like seriously, and with labeling them all. So that's what we did. We ran some chemical tests on them. We looked at the pH and things like that, just to cover all bases basically. These were the results. So that was the mean soil carbon density in every location. So there you could see that these locations really did vary quite a bit amongst one another. This was a typical soil carbon profile. So like I was saying, way up top, so if you imagine where it says 0, you have the horizontal 0 axis there, that's the ground, that's where the grass grows. And then you have a lot of carbon in these upper 10 to 20 centimeters, because that's where the root layer is of the grasses. And then as you go down, there's less and less carbon. And then as you go down below a depth of sort of 50, 60 centimeters, the carbon almost stays the same. It's not much anymore, but it also doesn't decrease as much anymore. It's what we call refractory carbon. So it's the carbon that's there, that's not broken down anymore. And that's the carbon that's really interesting for us if we're looking at long-term carbon storage. If we really want to store carbon out of the atmosphere away for a long, long time, millennia, potentially, if you don't dig it up in between, then the deep carbon storage is what really is interesting. And it doesn't look like much, it looks a bit puny, but this is soil carbon density in gram per cubic centimeter. So even if you only have 0.005 grams of carbon, but it's in a cubic centimeter, if you imagine how many cubic centimeters there are in a marsh, you can imagine that it's a lot of carbon, even though these numbers on first glance don't look very impressive. But if you really think about it's a cubic centimeter, then you kind of understand that it is a lot of carbon that is stored away. Even that deep store carbon, it's still a lot that the marshes are storing. Now, what's especially interesting is when something like this happens. This is what we love. So this is actually quite typical to happen in some of these marshes. Now, what happens there is we've got the curve that we would expect. It starts out with a lot of carbon up there in the root level, and then it goes down as you would expect. But then all of a sudden, you've got a lot more carbon down at 40 centimeters than you would normally in a model expect. So if you'd run a model, you'd have this little dot at 40 centimeters down by between 0.01 and 0, what the modeling would give you. Now, in this case, why has this happened? What's going on here? This has to do with the history of this very marsh. So this is basically like traveling back in time. If we're looking at this core, we have in 2021 up top, we have the current salt marsh, we have the grasses, and we have the first 10 centimeters that, or like the first centimeters that are the root layer. we see that at 10 centimeters, we're at around 1963. Dark brown earth, it's already a salt marsh. There's a lot of organic matter in there. Then we have a bunch of light sediments, which correspond here to where there's really a drop in carbon. So these would be sandy sediments, probably marine, or like most likely marine. And this was certainly some kind of flooding event where there was actually, at this very space, there was no salt marsh, but there was it was permanently flooded. And these are marine sediments, that sandy sediments that got deposited there while the marsh was flooded. When we're down at 40 centimeters, for example, in the year 1800, if you had come to this very spot, you wouldn't have seen a salt marsh, but it would have just been flooded. And then at about 50 centimeters, all of a sudden there's some darker sediment. You will find some old rests, probably of root material, somewhere in there as well. We didn't have the funds to do a lot of the more sophisticated checks on that, but you could definitely see that this is probably old salt marsh sediment. So this would have been, if you went there in 1700, it would have looked pretty much like it looks today. There would have been a salt marsh there. And that's what's deposited there. And then there was a flooding event, which basically covered that all up with this lighter sediment. And then bit by bit, a salt marsh started building up again. So in a marsh that has a history like that, we're very likely to find a lot more carbon stored at depth than we would expect if we're just running the model, which means that you have to combine the models with a solid knowledge about the local history of the marsh. So there you're looking at old maps, at old photographs, at anecdotal stories about huge floods. I know that there were some huge winter floods in England, somewhere, I think, in around actually 1700 something. There was like some huge storms that flooded a lot of the coast. So there could be such a storm event there that actually flooded that marsh. So the models are only as good as our knowledge of an area is. If we don't know this, then the model isn't really going to tell us how much carbon is actually stored in that marsh. So that's what I found always very mind-blowing about this, is that you can, just by using a plastic tube, you can hundreds of years, and you're opening up this tube and you're literally looking at earth that takes you back to like 1600s, 1400s. There's different methods, some different aging methods. I don't know if anyone can imagine why we always know 1963. 1963 is like a magic number for dating, in soil dating. I don't know if anyone wants to unmute themselves who knows why 1963 is one of these.
A lot of snow.
Sorry?
A lot of snow. It was a very snowy spring.
No, it's not the snow.
No, right?
No, but it's a fallout. It's a different type of fallout, a less pretty type of fallout. It's from the radioactives, from the bomb testings. So it's from the nuclear tests that were run in the early 60s. So you find a higher amount of one of the radioactive elements, and I never say which one because I'm always afraid that I'm saying the wrong one, but there's one that you find there, and then you know if you have a higher concentration of that is the 60s or the early 60s. So that's always good to kind of get an idea of where you are with the dating, and then you can kind of build it from there. So that's one of the things that we found by sort of drilling deeper, that you really have to look at the history of the marshes in order to be able to determine how much carbon they store. The model alone won't do the trick. And that's some stuff that scientists find especially exciting when you all of a sudden see, like, oh my God, I'm looking at the carbon storage, and I'm looking at the soil porosity, and the lines are basically mirroring each other. So soil porosity seems to really have to do with carbon storage. So that was one of our findings. So that was exciting. Elevation, yeah, so I was going to go through this. Interestingly, plant communities were actually not very important, which was interesting because part of our team had been involved in developing a citizen science project, which was based on around an app, where you could give in the plant communities of a salt marsh, and then it would predict the carbon storage capacity. But what we found was that was actually probably not working very well, because the only difference you could see was really there was more carbon in places where there was a lot of reed and juncus, but that's just because they're the biggest plants. And then there was less carbon where there weren't any plants. But if you looked at sort of all of the plants in the middle, it was kind of like, yeah, that the plant communities didn't really tell you much at all about the carbon storage capacity. And the bottom line of all that research was that we saw that the higher up you went in the marsh, the more carbon it stored, which kind of made sense because there are more plants, more possibilities to capture carbon, and also the marsh is, there's a bigger layer of sediments, basically. So there was an increase with elevation, and was really important was that we saw that the drivers for carbon storage really changed with depth. So in the top 15 centimeters, the most important drivers were elevation, relative to sea level, and pH. So obviously chemical processes were important because there was still a lot of chemistry going on in the soil. And then below 15 plus centimeters, the most important driver was the sediment porosity, so the sediment properties of the place where the marsh was. So this is like the sediment properties, as in what is the underlying geology. So that was really interesting because most of the models, as I was saying before we started, most of the models actually looked at the wrong drivers if you wanted to look at deep carbon storage. So you couldn't really, they weren't very good at predicting deep carbon storage at all. They were quite good at predicting carbon storage up in the first 15 centimeters, but they were quite useless in predicting carbon storage deeper down. So that sort of triggered this whole discussion then about which models to use. And then I think as Paul was saying earlier, the problem is always the comparability of the studies. So because so far most studies have used a certain set of models, it's kind of difficult to break away from that, because then your data isn't going to be comparable with other data anymore. So that's kind of like a new system. You're kind of dependent on everyone else then also using that new system, so that you produce data that you can actually compare with one another. But yeah, so that was what we found. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer any questions. If anything remained unclear or you want any, I'm going to try my best to give more information about anything you might be interested in.
Thank you very much, Scott. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Stuff there. If there's anybody who wants to ask a question, please put something either in the chat or wave around so that we can see what you want to ask. John, I see your. Okay. I saw John first. So John. You have to unmute yourself, I think. Can't hear you, John.
Can't hear you yet.
You have to
unmute.
Yes, now.
Yeah.
Right. Have you got me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you both. Being a Bristolian and having been out on a rather underpowered motorboat in the Severn Estuary, that looks like Portishead and Avonmouth rather than Bristol. Yeah.
True.
Okay, it's near Bristol, which is what you would associate. So the salt flats, the salt marshes, are in fact south of Portishead on the Somerset coast. Yeah. But I had not really realised that there were any salt marshes on that coast at all.
Yep, that's
have they developed relatively recently?
I don't think that they're developed that recently. It's just that people aren't aware of them because they're so small.
Yeah.
I think that's more the problem, and that's what they've been. We had a huge event there last summer, a salt marsh day, with a local nature protection group, where the sole purpose was to tell people who live in Portishead that there is a salt marsh, and people were very surprised, and hardly any of the locals were aware that there is a salt marsh there. So
Right.
I think it's really because it's that small.
Yep. It's just as you say, and rather unfortunately, as many places are, just a dog walking ground.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. I saw VAD also was indicating, and then
Yes, please. Yeah, what I want to ask is the carbon that's in the soil. What form is it? Is it just normal carbon? Is it organic compounds or what?
It's mainly organic compounds. So it's in the soil in different shapes and forms, but I would say most of it is organic compounds, which is why, so it changes, as it goes deeper and deeper, because in the beginning it's basically all still organic compounds, and then these are broken down by chemical processes as long as there's still aeration in the soil. And then as you go deeper and deeper, you basically get simpler compounds, you could say, which are then more stable, which is why it's more stable carbon when it goes further
But
down.
they're not the new coal measures.
No.
Thank you. Thank you.
okay, so I've now got 3 hands I can see. I've got Claude I can see visually, and then 2 hands raised electronically. Anne Forsyth, I think, was the first one I saw. So I go to Anne, then Claude, then Paul.
It was Martin that wanted to ask. So
okay.
Yeah, one of the more impressive graphics was the one that contrasted carbon sequestration between various land ecosystems and the salt marsh ones. And it was impressive as it was, but then when you looked, it had a log scale at the side.
Absolutely.
So the difference was even bigger than you were showing.
Yeah.
And in many ways, that's one of the core messages of what you've been saying to me, is the importance of these as a sequestration system. But that graph underplays the significance.
It's true. It actually it's great you point that out, because I literally only noticed that, I think, the last time that I gave the presentation, when I was going through the slides, I was all of a sudden like, hang on, that's a log. So, and the funny thing is, I went back into the original literature where I got that graph from, and they don't even mention it. So it's really, it's an important point, actually. And it's good you mentioned it now again, because back then I had made a note that I wanted to pass that on to my to the professor I was working with, to just sort of point it out to him, because I think it's true, it underplays it. So we should really make the graph show just how enormous the difference is.
Yeah.
They may be very efficient, but they're very small.
Yeah, that's true. And they don't have, I don't know, maybe you could say they're not sexy. They're not sexy like the way that the tropical forest is sexy, or coral reef, or they just don't have that certain, wow, you don't imagine David Attenborough sort of like going through the salt marsh and meeting exciting creatures. I think they just undersell themselves, really. They're, I think it's a lot about awareness raising, because they don't sort of offer themselves up in the same way that other habitats maybe offer themselves up for.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks. Claude.
Yes, I was. Thank you for that talk. I knew nothing about marshes, so obviously learned a lot.
Great.
I was wondering whether, to some extent, the underground level worked in the same way that you would find in a forest or in the grass, through mycelium, small creatures, worms. We mentioned aeration a minute ago. Did you make any observations about this, or is that separate?
So we didn't actually look at that much, but I know that it works. It works somewhat the same, but also differently due to the very high level of salinity in the soil. So you have a lot less going on in terms of worms, for example. If you just take like sort of the obvious, you take the earthworm. which you would find in any a very important protagonist in a normal meadow, wouldn't be as important a protagonist in a salt marsh, especially not in the lower reaches of the salt marsh because of the salinity of the soil. So it's a different chemical makeup, but still I don't know about the myceliums actually. I don't know about how they react to salinity. That's not my field at all. But I would imagine it's quite a different chemistry. I think the most important difference as far as sort of terrestrial boggy soil goes in comparison to salt marshes is that if you're looking at peat bogs, for example, they also store a lot of carbon, but the chemistry in the soil is such that they also produce methane, which then makes them less efficient for climate change mitigation, because methane is such an important, very, very powerful gas that also causes global warming. Whereas salt marshes don't produce methane because of the salinity in the soil, because the chemistry works differently. I'm no chemist. I've sort of I did two modules of chemistry and sort of survived through them. So I don't know that much about soil chemistry, but I know that some of the processes are quite different compared to terrestrial habitats.
Thanks very much.
How deep are the sediments in these salt marshes?
It's very
Because
different.
We compare that with the woodland around us in North Leeds, where the average soil depth is about 6 inches before you hit bedrock.
Yeah, so they will usually be much deeper. So I mean, we cored down to up to I think 1.20 meters were the longest course we had, and we were nowhere near reaching bedrock. So because of the buildup of sediments over the years, especially if you have an old marsh, I mean, it kind of depends. There are some marshes that are newly formed marshes where there will be less sediment. But I think if you have an old salt marsh that's been building up over hundreds of years, the sediments are very, very deep. Which again is one of the reasons that they're so powerful for carbon storage, because the sediments are so deep. Yeah.
Paul, your question?
Well, a couple of points really. When I think you're right about very stormy, there was something I learned in about the last month, I think, that a third of the British Navy's ships got sunk at the beginning of the 18th century.
That was the one I did by mind.
It was a monster. Yeah. I was just, could you point out to the Yorkshire folk here, are there good ones off the, on the Yorkshire coast, marshes to have a look at? Because I'm not sure I've never, noticed. Because I'm a new, it's not really my thing. I would, until this talk, I really, see wet bits of sea, but I don't know what's a salt marsh. That kind of...
Well, I mean, a lot of I'm not very familiar with Yorkshire. The parts of Yorkshire I know, I've just seen the soft cliffs. So that's where I was. So yeah, so there wouldn't be any marshes there because you've got the steep cliffs.
Yeah. But I saw some dots on your map that you had near the Humber, I think.
Yeah, the Humber estuary, there will be some marshes around the Humber estuary, for sure. Estuarine, it's like around the Severn or around the Wash, you'll find, there you will find the biggest marshes. There are marshes also around places where there are actually cliffs, but they will be very small, and they will also be pretty shaky as far as how long they're going to last, because then it just takes one big storm, one big cliff collapse, and then that was it for the marsh. So.
Oh, and just one other thing I was going to say. Going up the Thames, how salty does it get up there? Because that's I know there's lots of mud flats, but also there's the Swanscombe Marsh, of which there is some controversy about, because somebody wants to build a theme park on it, and the bug life, which is the invertebrate conservation trust. I don't know much about bugs, but I give them a bit of money, so I get a bit of information back from them. I like the idea of the smallest things on the earth having a bit of a shout, you know, a bit of a say. So, but there was one there, Swanscombe Marsh, and I'm not sure if that's salty. It's somewhere on the southern, you know, shore of the Thames, I think. Yeah, in Kent. So
yeah, and it sort of rings a faint bell in my mind that someone wanted to build a theme park on a marsh, but I'm not familiar with it, so
okay.
I wouldn't know.
Okay, well, that's me for the moment. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you. John Douglas?
Yeah, thanks very much. That was very interesting, especially your references to Sunderland Point. And I spent some time there in the 1960s and walked round to where the nuclear power station is or was. And at that time, I think they were just commissioning it. Would it be possible to disaggregate the dark patches of soil related to nuclear testing and the dark patches of soil, related to the existence of nuclear power stations? Because there are at least 3 in the area. There's Heysham, there's up at, you know, in Cumbria, and then up in Scotland at Chapel Cross. So there must have been, you know, some influence there. And I just wondered if you'd come across anything specific in terms of your soil samples.
That's actually an interesting question. We didn't test our samples for radioactivity at all because we didn't have the equipment to do that. But I've come across that very question before because there is a lot of talk about radiocarbon dating and how that could be influenced by actually, like, for example, decommissioned nuclear power stations. And I don't know if there's been a final word spoken on that or how that is being dealt with, because I would agree that around nuclear power stations, you're probably always going to have a higher amount of nuclear trace elements in the soil. But I don't know how that would compare to the amounts that you have from the bomb testing outfall, for example. That's not my field.
I suppose it depends how well contained the nuclear power station is. But you mentioned it come in 1963. I think it's 1961 was the biggest H bomb ever blown up by the Soviet Union. So maybe.
Yeah, but 1963 was actually the date of the ban treaty, the test ban treaty. So after 63, there probably won't be anything.
Yeah, that's why it's the cutoff date, basically, the 63. Yeah.
But that won't affect carbon dating, which is related to the decay of carbon-13, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Carbon 14. Yeah. No, that's true. That was not correct. So there's carbon dating, which is related on the decay of carbon 14, and two more carbon 14, carbon 32. I think there's one more, and isotopes. And then there's radioactive isotope dating, which some people claim is more. It's basically even more accurate than carbon dating, but that is a different dating technique.
I think that's over a much shorter timescale, though, isn't it?
It is, yeah. That's interesting if you're looking at a couple of 100 years or like 1,000 years, maybe. But yeah.
I think I don't know whether Martin or Anne, if you've got your hand up, is that from leftover from last time, or you got another question?
Yeah, I was going to come in first of all on the Yorkshire salt marsh issue. And as someone who's born in Goole, the area around the Humber is the obvious area where you've got mudflats going into salt marsh as you go further inland. So we have got them, but it's in that sort of sheltered environment within Spurn Point. Swanscombe is a well-known lower Stone Age site. There's quite a quantity of material coming out of there, but it's coming out of levels of gravel. So I'm not sure. The marsh is obviously something separate of Swanscombe. And the other one was, yes, we have got radioactive discharge. In fact, Sellafield was discharging directly into the North Sea, radioactive wastes, until relatively recently. Before they had to stop it. So that was one of the problems with, speaking as a former chair of nuclear-free local authorities, that was one of the problems with Sellafield as a place. The influence on radiocarbon dating was around Southampton, where they were pumping up old water from depths as part of a geothermal scheme, and it was suggested it might be affecting, because it was obviously in radiocarbon dating terms completely dead, that it would then affect samples taken in those areas.
Okay.
So we need to be quite careful about those different things.
Yeah.
Sorry, there was a range of things that came up in the points before I put my hand up.
Okay, Jane Moon has a hand up.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. It was a really fascinating talk. I wondered if you knew anything about the marshes up in the Hebrides, the outer Hebrides areas. When we were visiting Harris, the island of Harris, we got very interested by what's called the marshes, which is the kind of area behind what are obviously marshes, and they look really fascinating. And I wondered if any research has been done on them, or whether you know anything about them.
There's actually that's basically a thing in itself. The marsh is a habitat which is somewhat different from a classic salt marsh habitat, because it's also got to do with I believe with the traditional way of growing the grass, the specific grass there, right? So I know that there's research done, and there's also research done that looks at actually carbon storage capacity, and actually at bringing more of that environment back to these areas. But it's nothing that I've ever been involved in. I've only done like normal English salt marshes.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Is there anyone else?
Did Andy?
Oh, Julie Brown, yeah, or Andy.
Julie Brown in disguise.
I can never find the little box that you go to change the name. This is my wife's
Don't worry,
laptop.
Julie, it's all right.
I just, well, two things really. One, I don't know of any salt marshes around here. But when we've been down to some of my wife's relatives down in Essex, around Clacton and around there, the salt marshes, and I've found them to be extremely, certainly as well near the seawall, degraded places full of supermarket trolleys and old motorbikes and rubbish and what have you. I don't know whether Scott has actually seen this where he's been, but I tend to find it quite dispiriting to walk through these places, because they're just full of discarded rubbish. Right? It has made me wonder on quite a few occasions when I've wandered through these places what effect that is having on these environments.
Yeah, so that's exactly it's coming back to the problem that people are not aware of what they are. It's a wasteland, but many people will say like, oh, well, this is just a wasteland, so you might as well dump your old trolleys there, or walk your dog, let your dog run free there. So again, I think it comes down to awareness. I mean, this whole area around Clacton, there's some of the most deprived coastal communities in the country down there. So I would imagine they just also have other problems than thinking about their marshes. So if you're going into sort of the social hotspots, you will always find that it's very difficult to sort of explain to people that there's a value in these places which they just perceive as well, it's just sort of like this uninteresting area in their backyard. The marshes I've been to, thankfully, were not affected by anything like that. They were very well taken care of, because they were either farmland or they were a protected area, or one of them was sort of within the grounds of a big campsite, which was sort of kept quite clear. What it does, actually, what this question brings me to is what marshes are affected by are actually microplastics. Don't know how much they would be affected by bigger trash. I mean, you have to the problem with that wildlife could get caught in it and everything. But if the ecosystem itself, I don't think the marsh will care much if there's a trolley lying in it. But what we do see, and there's some research from the University of Hull, I think, was it University of Hull? But somewhere around there, they're doing some research on the effect of microplastics on marshes, because as I said, marshes are often in estuarine settings, and then all the plastics that come down with the river, they will basically, like I said, marshes can act like filters, and they also can act like filters for microplastics. So we're seeing now, apparently, a lot higher concentrations of microplastics in marshes, and there's research now, because microplastics often act as aggregating things for chemicals. So certain chemicals will adhere to microplastics, and then if you have a high load of microplastics in the place, it might actually affect the soil health and because of the chemicals that are attaching to the microplastics. And so there's some very new research. There was a PhD project that only started last year, I think, which was looking at that. I think one of the first projects. So certainly marshes will be affected by human output, and I think probably the small things like the microplastics are the ones that are potentially more detrimental than, say, like a bunch of old trolleys and motorbikes lying in them, even though we aesthetically speaking, of course these have the bigger impact.
Yeah, they're more noticeable than microplastics.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, thanks for that.
Okay, thank you very much. No other points, questions, comments? No, can't see any hands risen.
Well, I did have another question that sort of occurred to me. When you were talking about these marshes that get sort of permanently swallowed up by the sea, I don't know whether you mentioned this, but it was in my mind that the carbon that these marshes that no longer exist because they're under the water all the time had sequestered and fixed. What happens to it? Does it just degrade and go back into the atmosphere again, or does it stay in sediments under the sea?
It stays. That is so the flooding of a marsh does actually probably not negatively affect the carbon it has already stored.
Right.
It only negatively affects the carbon that it then cannot store anymore in the future. But no, they're locked up. They're then literally they'll just stay in the ground underneath the sea.
Well, that's something at least.
Yeah.
So is coal, I suppose, but we seem to release it from coal in the past.
Yeah, unfortunately, my father was a coal miner, so he probably helps release a lot of carbon back into the atmosphere, bless him, when he was alive.
Well, yeah, I guess he didn't know about it at that time.
No, he got out in the late 60s.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, what's the scope increasing the amount of salt marsh or creating new ones?
There's quite some projects actually doing that, and I think it will probably be a trend because the government's policy regarding the coastlines kind of goes together with that, because there are there's this plan that the government has looking at coastal communities where they're kind of saying the policy here is hold the line, so they're going to build sea defenses and defend whatever land is settled on. And then there's the policy of managed realignment, where you're kind of trying to push people back into a safe zone and then use natural solutions, like, for example, the creation of new marshes for flood protection and protection for erosion. So that would be creation of new marsh areas. And then there's the policy do nothing, which basically means abandon the place and the people who live there. And that could then also result in the natural creation of new marshes once the sea is allowed to move in there. So I think in the future we'll see new marshes created also, because there's now the policy that you have to create a net gain for biodiversity, which means that a lot of port and harbor developments, for them all of a sudden it becomes interesting to actually, they have to create something, for example, in Bristol or Portishead, but I don't want to say the wrong thing, but somewhere there around Bristol in the harbor development, port development, they've bought they're going to build something there, and they've bought a huge area on the other side of the Severn Estuary where they are going to put a salt marsh. That's right now I think it's just grazing land for sheep, because they will destroy some on their side when they're building, but then they're going to create an even bigger one on the other side so that there's a net gain in the end. And that's, I think, one of the most impressive newly created marshes is probably, if you're in that area, Sturt Marshes around Hinkley Point Power Station, where they've created a huge salt marsh area, and they've only started in 2011, I believe. 2011 they started, and if you go there now, it looks like it's just a finished. It's just a wild space. It's amazing. There are eels and otters, and it's just an amazing place, and it's incredible. 10 years. So that's because it's so dynamic. It's a very fast moving environment, so you can actually have quick results as well, which makes it very attractive, I think, also for sort of rewilding schemes, because you actually get quick results with it. So yeah.
Where's that again?
That's Sturt Marshes. So that's close to Hinkley Station.
Okay.
They're paying for half a ward, and they're sort of claiming that they're basically the big spender behind it, but they've not actually been involved in creating it. So.
That's what public relations departments are for.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was going to say, I suppose, does tourism come into all this a bit as well? Because some of these places would be wonderful places to visit from.
Yeah, especially for birders. I think there's already quite a market among birders to come there. But yes, for sure, tourism plays into it, and the need also for local recreation, so upgrading the area so that local people are more aware of it, and also aware of the benefits outside of just walking your dog, but doing other things there. So yeah, definitely, that's I think there's a lot of scope for really great projects there, and I think there's quite a bit in the pipeline. Also because with net zero and the UK not really having any big woodlands anyway, and busy destroying some of the last ones they have, the marshes are within the net zero strategy just also interesting because they're powerful in sequestering carbon. So that is, of course, from a policy point of view, something that strengthens that approach as well to create new marshes.
Mike, yeah, go on.
Thank you. It's been a really fascinating evening. Obviously, your focus has been on salt marshes, but are ordinary marshes, do they have any of the advantages that or you know, do they have any super efficiencies over other, you know, grasslands or ordinary marsh also be something that's useful in terms of carbon capture?
So a freshwater marsh, would be capturing carbon just like any other plant habitat. It would have a lot of the ecosystem services that a saltwater marsh has as well. So it would act as a flood protection from the river. It would be a hotspot for biodiversity. So I think they're very comparable. There's actually not that much data on freshwater marshes for some reason. I don't know, at least not aware of much data within Europe. probably in the United States, where they have very huge freshwater marshes around some of the big rivers, there might be more data there. But I would expect that they would also be, because it's the same thing. They have a quick turnover. They have a quick build-up of sediment. Like I said, the chemistry might be less, might be a little less efficient, because I suppose that with freshwater marshes, it's a bit like with peat bogs. You're always going to have this buildup of methane as the because of the decomposition processes, and the saline, the salt is very important there for changing the chemistry, so that you don't have that methane buildup. But I could imagine they're also probably good at it, but I wouldn't know any data related to it.
Okay. Excuse me, could I just say that I used to do microbiology before I retired, and I think that possibly one of the things that you might be referring to is the buildup of methane due to methanogenic bacteria. That are anaerobic.
Yeah.
Which, if there's a lot of salt about, it tends to sort of inhibit the massive growth of these sort of bacterial biofilms down in the depths of the soil.
Yeah.
Which might explain that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Isn't where peat bogs come from, but they come from the peat that's just about to be stopped being used as for garden, people on people's gardens would have come from marshes in the first place, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I think one of the arguments against the use of peat is exactly that. If you dig up the peat, you're basically releasing a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. So it's very bad for the carbon balance to do that.
Well, thank you very much again, Scott. That's been fascinating and raised a lot of questions and comments. So
thank you. Thank you very much for all the questions.
Excellent, because really good discussion there. That's and questions and stuff.
One of the advantages of being online that we can actually ask people who aren't anywhere near Leeds to come and give a talk, and it's been really good. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and have a wonderful year.
Thank you. You too.
Good luck.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.